Hey, it's Benji Cole, son of Al Cole from CBS Radio, welcoming you to another edition of People of Distinction, the talk that gives an in-depth view of some of the most dynamic, intelligent, and successful people on the planet. Run to our website, peopleofdistinction.org, for more info, or you can email me directly at benji@alcoleenterprises.com. And on the line with us today, we have Henry M.Sobell. We're going to be discussing a couple of his books. One, Premeltons in DNA, and then the second book is called Organization of DNA in Chromatin, available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And guys, I will say, both of these books are meant for a very specific audience, okay? It's really primarily geared for students, for graduate students, or even master PhD students in this particular field. So if a lot of the information goes over your head, just know it's meant for a very specific audience. And I will say, Henry was brought to People of Distinction today by some of the best movers in the business. Author, Reputation Press Publishing. If you have a book that you'd like moved, well, move it to Author Reputation Press. You can find them at authorreputationpress.com. And I'm very excited to have Henry here on the line. Listen, he's the expert on the matter. He's going to be able to articulate all the nuances in each of his books much better than I ever could, because a lot of this information goes well over my head. I'm not the audience the book is meant for, but even though that is the case, I still very much am looking forward to having Henry here on the line, because this is going to be an education for me just as much as it is for you, and I'm very much looking forward to it. So Henry, first and foremost, thank you so much for being a guest with us today at People of Distinction. How are you?
I am fine, and thank you very much for your introductory comments.
Henry, before we jump into the book, tell our listening audience a little bit more about yourself.
I'm now 85, still strong, still active, still thinking. I'm no longer, of course, at the University of Rochester. I'm now retired. I'm living in the Adirondacks in New York State. And I'm plenty busy with other things. I'm a violinist. I play music. I used to play a lot of tennis. Yeah, I used to hit balls against the pros.
There you go.
So I have done a lot of things in my life. And also people should realize that us scientists are not so are perfectly easy to get along with in terms of the overall scheme of things in life. We understand a lot of things that happen between human beings.
Absolutely.
I have been asked to comment about two books recently published by Author Reputation Press, Canton, Massachusetts, entitled Premeltons in DNA and Organization of DNA in Chromatin. These books summarize work done earlier while I was a professor of chemistry and molecular biophysics at the University of Rochester. This work eventually leading to an understanding of how the famous anti-cancer agent called actinomycin D binds to DNA and exerts its mechanism of action. The cover of the first book shows actinomycin binding to beta DNA, a DNA structure very different from its normal B or A forms. Sugar residues alternate between their C3' endo and C2' endo puckers, causing every other base pair to remain partially unstacked. This gives rise to additional flexibility in its structure, which allows the phenoxazone ring system on actinomycin to intercalate between self-complementary deoxy-PG-PC base-paired sequences. Beta DNA can be considered to be a premelted, metastable, and hyperflexible DNA form, which arises spontaneously within the centers of entities called premeltons. Premeltons possess dynamical properties and are known to physicists as breather solitons. They are expected to appear at the early melting regions of DNA to nucleate DNA melting and, therefore, to act as attachment sites for the RNA polymerase enzyme in the process of gene activation. The search to understand the detailed nature of gene activation is one of the leading areas of study in molecular biology. Genes are continually turned on and off during embryogenesis, as well as throughout one's lifetime. Abnormalities in this process can cause the appearance of cancer cells having lost the property of contact inhibition, which allows them to metastasize. Studies in this area, therefore, can lead to a fundamental understanding of life's processes and be an important milestone in modern medicine, possibly leading to a cure for cancer. The cover of the second book shows how DNA is organized in chromatin at its first level of compaction. Rather than binding uniformly along its length, nucleosomal DNA has been proposed to consist of multiple segments of both B and A DNA held together by kinks, meaning sharp bends when forming its left-handed toroidal superhelical structure. This predicts that if there were an equal probability that both 10 base pairs of B DNA or 11 base pairs of A DNA exist within any given segment of the left-handed toroidal superhelical structure, then a population of such aperiodic structures is expected to give rise to the periodic cutting patterns observed experimentally. This would be true for naked DNA molecules immobilized on a calcium phosphate crystalline surface as well, provided they also formed left-handed toroidal superhelices under these conditions. In both cases, probability considerations predict cutting patterns to be symmetrically distributed around integral multiples of 10.5 base pairs return, the relative magnitudes of the surrounding peaks in these patterns being covered by the binomial distribution. Both books can be obtained through Amazon.com and BarnesandNobles.com. They can also be ordered from thousands of bookstores throughout the world.
Thank you so much for really going into that description, Henry. Listen,
Yes.
Everything is so impressive. And of course, as we stated, it's meant for a very specific audience. Now, just to backtrack a little, why did you feel that books of this magnitude needed to be written?
Yes, the concept of a premelton in DNA has to do with the early melting properties of the DNA, and these happen at the beginning and ends of genes. That's known. And the reason for this is because there's an enzyme, a protein, that binds to these regions and undergoes a series of conformational changes, liberating energy and opening up the DNA, or at the end of the gene, closing the DNA. So these books give you the physical explanation, a theory, that this, of course, it's a theory, which allows you to understand how this happens.
Wonderful.
So that probably summarizes what I would say to that question.
Absolutely. Now, did you feel compelled to write these books? As you started off by saying, this all originated when you were a professor, right? And you were teaching.
Yes, I'm 85 years old now. And basically, I was a professor there in my 30s and 40s,
Mm-hmm.
So that is when we discovered a large number of crystal structures that contain drugs bound to small little DNA fragments, and did their structural analyses. And of course, this is all information that's been published in scientific journals. So I've had this information for many years, and I've thought about its meaning, and the meaning comes out into these books.
Fantastic. So it's information that, of course, has been since put out there. So now you wanted to put that information into a book specifically for, is it biology students?
Yes, well, for anybody interested in really understanding the DNA molecule and how it works.
Mm-hmm.
I also, of course, I should have said something about the coronavirus epidemic going on now. Here is a good example, that the coronavirus is influenza-type virus that goes ahead and invades a normal cell and captures the regular machinery of making the RNA, messenger RNA, off the DNA. In this case, it makes the viral RNA off the DNA, and that directs its deadly consequences. That's the process. That's the process of infection, and we now realize that we have to understand this process exactly, and that's exactly what these two firms, particularly Moderna, has done. They have now used the complex between the virus particle and the DNA sequence that it binds to in DNA, and it goes ahead and makes more copies of itself, and of course directs its own synthesis for its biological molecules. For cell division. So I mean, this is part of understanding the nature of how viruses affect mammalian cells. So I think it's also related to these questions related to cancer too, because there are examples of that increasing cancer, not just bad illnesses like the coronavirus.
Absolutely. Guys, again, here on the line with Henry M.Sobell. We're discussing his books, Premeltons in DNA, and then his other book, Organization of DNA in Chromatin, both of which are available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. You know, Henry, this has all been fantastic thus far. Next question that I'd love to ask is, what are you hoping to see people do with your books? I mean, of course, again, as we've stated multiple times in this interview, these books are meant for a very specific audience. Okay? Now, of course, it could be based just on the surface level on soul education. But what are you hoping to see people do with your books? Are you hoping that they take it a step further than the education, or is it solely based upon that?
Well, that's an excellent question. Of course, I've thought about that very carefully. I'm trying to look at now part of my book here, the preface. It turns out that understanding DNA and all of its properties is the fundamental understanding of how life ever came on the earth, even just began. So what you're in fact looking at is what everybody knows is we are all wondering, how did human beings evolve? How did animals first appear? Were the age of dinosaurs and so on and so forth, and get back to the primitive Earth? And how did life begin? Okay, all these questions, of course, are related to the origin of DNA. So what I'd suggest to the audience is that they read my preface for both books, which basically give you the overall reasons for being interested in subjects like these.
Fantastic. Well, listen, guys, there you have it. Pick up the book again for soul education purpose, but really, what will happen after that, right? When you get a basic understanding of DNA, what other type of books can come and manifest after that? And it starts with these two fantastic books by Henry M.Sobell. Henry, as we're tying up this wonderful interview, listen, the only other question that I can think of that I really would love to go into is, what's next for you? I mean, do you foresee any other books coming in the future that you'd also like to put out for education's sake?
I think I've done my deed. These two books basically summarize my career, the whole reason for my leaving this. I studied medicine many years back. I'm an MD, but I went to MIT to learn how to do science, with another outstanding person, Alexander Rich, at the Department of Biology at MIT many years back. And so all of us are interested in very, very, very not only medical questions, but very fundamental questions about what is life, what's life all about, how did it evolve. So this is basically part of the story. I don't have any idea. I don't have any more need really to write another book. These books suffice.
There you go. And listen, they sound like very extensive books that lead and cap off such a magnificent career that you've, of course, established. So congratulations on everything that you've been able to do. This has been wonderful and so educational, so profound having you here on our show. Guys, one last time. Here talking to Henry M.Sobell. We finished discussing his two books. The first one, Premeltons in DNA, followed by Organization of DNA in Chromatin, both of which, again, available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Do yourself a favor. If you are in that medical field, if you are interested in that biology field, and you want more of an education, you can't find a greater source of information than Henry M.Sobell himself. Go to Amazon, go to Barnes & Noble, pick up your copies of each one of those books. You surely will not be disappointed. Henry, this has been profound. This has been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for being a guest with us today at People of Distinction.
Thank you for your interest. I thought it went very well. I loved what you had to say. Thanks very much.